The morning air hung still, not yet broken by the sun's climb, the hush of a new day settling over the ranchlands like a quilt of silence. Dust clung to the edges of the grass where dew had failed to gather, and the earth smelled faintly of rain that had passed in the night. He moved along the fence line with slow steps, a giant of a man whose shadow stretched across the field like another post set deep in soil. His boots pressed steady marks into the dirt, the kind of marks that could last until the next storm, and his hands, broad, scarred, yet careful, rested against the rail as though the fence were a thing worth speaking to. It was then, in the quiet between bird call and breeze, that he heard it, a sound too small for the wide land to carry. A whimper, barely more than breath. He turned, ears sharpened not by curiosity but by memory, for he had heard such sounds long ago, from his own throat when hunger and fear met in the dark. The sound came from a hollow log, half-rotted, lying at the edge of the clearing where moss and shadow had made their home. He moved closer, each step heavy enough to stir dust but not harsh enough to scatter what hid there. A hand brushed against his belt, not for the gun but for steadiness, because he knew this was no animal cry. Two faces appeared, faint as ghosts, pressed close together in the hollow dark. Eyes too wide, too wary for children so small. Their cheeks bore streaks of grime, their hair clumped with rain and leaves, and their dresses, once bright perhaps, hung in tatters. They looked like sparrows blown from the nest, trembling in a fallen branch, and they did not rise until his shadow swallowed the log whole. He crouched, lowering the height that so often made others wary, and waited. Silence stretched, heavy as the weight of judgment. Then one child, no taller than his knee, lifted her chin, lips trembling as if words might cut her tongue. The whisper came thin, breaking against the air like twigs against stone. "Please don't beat us. We are already injured." The words struck him harder than any bullet. They carried with them the sting of belts and the burn of ropes, the old taste of copper when blood runs from the mouth. He felt his throat close, the giant of him undone by a sound smaller than the cry of a bird. For a long breath, he said nothing. Words had never been his trade, only the steady rhythm of work and the honesty of his back bent to earth. He looked at their arms, thin and marked, the knees scraped raw, and in their stillness he saw himself, once a boy pressed into corners, asking no one in particular to spare him. He extended his hand, slow as dusk slipping into night. The children flinched, pressed back into the hollow, and he let his hand remain, open and unhurried, as if offering them not command but choice. They watched him as though the world might end with a wrong move, and then, with the smallest courage born of desperation, one reached out, laying her tiny palm against the rough skin of his. He did not close his hand over hers. He only lifted, careful as if carrying water in a cracked bowl, and soon the second child followed, clutching the fabric of his shirt with surprising strength. Rising, he carried them both, one tucked against each arm, their bodies light as bundles of kindling, though far more fragile. The log behind them remained hollow, but no longer did it hold fear. It held only the echo of a night survived. His cabin was not far, though to children it must have seemed the whole world away. The girls did not speak as he walked, their heads pressed against his shoulders, but their eyes remained open, watching the sky as though to mark the path. He felt their breaths against his neck, shallow, uncertain, as though still bracing for pain. When the cabin came into view, rough-hewn logs, roof patched more than once, smoke curling faintly from the chimney, they stirred, but did not resist. He pushed the door open with his boot, the hinge sighing, and stepped inside. The room smelled of wood smoke and coffee long cooled. A table stood scarred by years of use, a single chair pulled close. The hearth glowed with the faint embers of last night's fire. He set the children down near the warmth, watching as they folded into themselves, small backs bent, hands tucked against their knees. They did not look at him. He moved with slow care, filling a tin cup with water from a jug and setting it on the floor before them. They glanced at each other, uncertain, then one leaned forward, sipping quick as if the drink might be stolen. The other followed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. He turned to the shelf, pulled down bread, hard, but still bread, and broke it into pieces, laying them out. The children snatched at it, stuffing their mouths, chewing fast. He did not stop them, though he knew the pain of eating too quickly. Hunger was its own teacher. As they ate, he sat at the table, resting elbows on the wood, his eyes fixed not on them but on the window, where morning light began to pierce the glass. He thought of the talk that would come if he led them into town. A man alone with 2 children, no wife, no kin. He could already hear the whispers, questions heavy with suspicion, judgments sharper than blades. But he also thought of the words that had greeted him at the log. "Please don't beat us." Words too old for such young mouths. When the bread was gone, the girls curled against each other, exhaustion pulling them down. He rose, gathered blankets from his bed, and laid them gently over the small forms. They did not stir. Only the rise and fall of their breaths assured him they lived. He stood over them, a mountain of a man whose heart beat unsteady in the quiet. He had not chosen this. The world had placed it before him, as it so often did, burdens, tests, mercies hidden as trials. He could walk away. He could carry them into town, hand them to whoever claimed them. It would be easier, safer. But as he turned toward the door, the smaller of the 2 stirred in her sleep, a hand slipping free of the blanket. Without thought, it found his boot, tiny fingers curling against the leather as though anchoring themselves to something solid. He froze, breath caught, and for the first time in years, he felt the tremor of tears rise unbidden. He looked down at the fragile grip, and knew, whether he wanted it or not, the hollow log had given him more than children. It had given him a choice he could not escape. The fire had burned low, leaving a hush in the cabin, a hush that seemed to carry the weight of years. The girls slept deep, curled against each other beneath the blankets he had laid, their faces slack with the kind of exhaustion that comes only after fear has loosened its grip. He moved quietly across the room, adding a stick of wood to the embers, watching sparks rise and fade, as if the fire itself carried the memory of their trembling whispers from the hollow log. When morning stretched its light through the cracks of the shutters, the girls stirred. Their eyes opened slow, wary, as though every corner of the room might hold some hidden hand ready to strike. They did not speak. Their silence was not the silence of peace but of testing, measuring if this place was safer than the last. He set another tin cup of water near them, tore bread into softer pieces, and left them within reach. He made no demand that they eat, yet after a long pause, they did, their small fingers moving fast, hiding pieces in the folds of the blanket as if preparing for the next storm. He let them. He understood the instinct of storing for a hunger that might return. Years ago, he had buried crusts under floorboards, believing they might be the difference between life and death. Hunger carved its lessons deep, and trust was slower to fill than an empty stomach. The day moved forward in quiet rhythms. He fetched water from the creek, patched a loose board in the door, and split wood, the rhythm of his axe echoing in the still air. Each time the sharp crack rang out, the girls jumped, shrinking back toward the wall. Their wide eyes followed him, measuring his size against their fear. It struck him, how strange it must seem, a giant towering over their smallness, his strength both their danger and their shelter. He did not try to soften the truth of his size. Instead, he let his actions speak. When the bucket was heavy, he carried it steady and set it down with care, not force. When he swept the hearth, he moved slow, each motion gentle, as if the room itself might bruise. Small signs, but they mattered. By midday, he decided they must see more than the 4 walls of his cabin. He lifted the latch and stepped onto the porch, tilting his hat against the light. The girls followed, hesitant, their bare feet padding softly on the worn boards. He led them to the corral where his horse, old and gray around the muzzle, stood swishing its tail. The twins froze, clutching each other's hands. The horse was tall, broad as the sky to them. The rancher stroked its neck, murmuring low. Then he stepped back, letting the girls see the calm in its dark eyes. For a long moment they watched, rooted by fear. Then, as if courage had crept up without asking, one girl let go of her sister's hand and reached out. Her tiny palm brushed the horse's coat, and a sound slipped from her lips. Laughter, quick and startled, like the breaking of ice in spring. The second child joined, their giggles rising, and for the first time since he had carried them from the log, the rancher heard joy in their voices. It was a fragile joy, brittle still, but it was something new. He felt it settle in his chest like a weight lifting, though he showed nothing on his face. Later he saddled the horse, not to ride but to fetch grain from town. Supplies ran thin, and children, no matter how careful, required more than scraps. He debated leaving them, but the thought of the cabin empty save for their small breaths unsettled him. So he took them along, setting one girl before him in the saddle, the other balanced against his chest, both wrapped in his arms as they rode. The town was small, but it had eyes sharper than nails and tongues quicker than the wind. When he dismounted, children in his arms, heads turned. Whispers slipped through the air before boots had crossed the street. Whose are they? Not his, that's certain. No wife with him. No family either. The girl shrank into his coat, sensing what was said without understanding every word. He felt the burn of old shame on his neck, the memory of being judged by nothing more than what he lacked. He did not answer the stares. He walked steady to the store, bought bread, beans, and cloth. He paid in coin, his silence a shield stronger than steel. But whispers follow, even after coins are counted. At the trough outside, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper words leaned close. You best think on what folks will say, keeping them without claim. Blood runs thicker than charity. He looked at her, his face unreadable. He did not speak. Sometimes silence was the only way to keep from burning bridges that could not be rebuilt. He lifted the girls once more, set them on the horse, and rode home with their heads pressed close to him. That night, the cabin felt heavier. The girls ate in silence, though slower this time, no longer hiding bread but chewing with careful bites. He watched them, the way their eyes flicked to him between mouthfuls, as if still deciding whether he was savior or captor. When they finished, they curled by the fire, whispering to each other words too soft to hear. He sat at the table, elbows onward scarred by years, staring at the broken doll one of them clutched. Its head was cracked, its dress torn, yet the child held it as if it were gold. Something in him stirred. Rising, he fetched a strip of cloth, needle, and thread. His fingers, clumsy with small work, stitched the doll's dress back together. When he handed it back, the girl's eyes widened, not with full trust, but with the beginning of it. They slept easier that night. Their breaths fell deeper, their hands less tight around the blankets. He sat awake long after, listening to the quiet, hearing in it not just the crackle of the fire but the faint echo of laughter by the corral. When sleep finally pulled at his eyes, he thought of the road, the dust that had risen the morning he carried them in. He wondered if someone might come looking, if past shadows would stretch into his cabin. The thought stayed with him as the fire dimmed. And in the last moment before he surrendered to rest, a knock sounded at the door, soft but steady, carrying with it the weight of something waiting to be named. The knock that had come the night before lingered in his thoughts long after it faded. No one stood waiting when he opened the door, only the wind brushing across the porch and the soft creak of boards settling in the night. Still, the sound carried with it a promise, that the world outside knew, and the world outside was watching. By morning, the twins woke to the warmth of the fire and the faint scent of beans simmering on the stove. They moved quieter now, their steps softer, but the fear in their eyes had not fully lifted. When he handed them bowls, they took them with hands too practiced in hunger, too wary to believe food would not be snatched away. He let them eat in silence, though every clatter of a spoon seemed to echo louder than the flames. Later, he led them into town again. His supplies were low, and though he had thought to spare them the stairs, he could not leave them alone in the cabin. The girls clung to either side of his coat as they walked the dusty street, their small bodies nearly hidden against the sweep of his long shadow. The town's chatter dimmed at their passing, voices dropping low, words slipping like snakes between boots and skirts. He's keeping them, they say. No kin. No wife. Nothing but silence for an answer. Doesn't seem right. A man that size with children that small. The words rode on the air, sharp as barbed wire. He heard them, though he did not break stride. His face remained carved in stillness, his jaw set against the urge to answer. He knew better. Words fed gossip like rain feeds fire. Better to keep walking, steady, as though their judgment could not pierce his hide. But the twins heard too. Their small hands tightened around his coat, and their eyes, wide and dark, flicked from face to face, learning already the weight of suspicion. Inside the store, the keeper hesitated, eyeing the girls. You'll need to account for them, he said. his voice flat but his gaze cutting. "Folks'll want to know." The rancher laid down coin, enough to cover flour and salt, sugar and cloth. His silence stretched between them until the storekeeper looked away, muttering, bagging the goods. The twins stayed pressed against him, their bodies stiff as fence posts, as if bracing for a blow that never came. When they stepped back into sunlight, the whispers rose again. A woman leaned against the hitching rail, her smile thin, her words sweetened with venom. "Children without blood find no home in this land. You best think on that, before someone thinks for you." He met her gaze, unblinking. She turned away first. But the words lingered, hanging heavy in the girl's ears. That night, back in the cabin, they were restless. They whispered together long after the fire dimmed, their voices a small tangle of fear. At last, one of them crept to his chair where he sat mending a strap. She laid her tiny hand over his, calloused from work, trembling but insistent. "Don't send us back," she whispered, her voice breaking like a brittle twig. "We're good now." Her sister appeared at her side, nodding, her eyes wide with pleading. They looked at him as if he were the last post holding a roof above them. His throat tightened, the strap falling from his lap. He could not answer in words. Words had always felt clumsy, too thin for the weight of such trust. Instead, he set the mended strap aside and pulled a blanket from his bed, wrapping it around them both. They leaned into him, small shoulders pressed against his chest, their bodies softening into a trust not yet whole, but beginning. Still, he knew trust could not quiet the voices outside his walls. Gossip, once loosed, grew like tumbleweed, rolling into every corner. The next days brought more stares, more whispers, louder now. A neighbor rode by, his tone sharp as he reined in. "You got no claim. Don't go making one." The rancher did not answer, but the words cut deep, echoing in the silence long after hoofbeats faded. He tried to shield the girls with routine. He showed them how to sweep the hearth, how to scatter grain for the hens, how to brush the horse's mane. Their laughter came more often now, light and sudden, like sunlight breaking through cloud. It stitched small seams in the fabric of his days, seams he had not known were missing. Yet even in their laughter, he saw the flinch whenever footsteps approached or a shadow passed the window. One evening, as dusk settled, the girls produced the broken doll again, its stitched dress already fraying. They placed it in his hands, as if trusting him to mend not just cloth but the fragile world it represented. He threaded the needle once more, his fingers clumsy but careful, and when he returned it, they held it as if he had handed them proof that something broken could still be made whole. The fire burned low that night, and he sat listening to their even breaths as they slept, the doll clutched between them. Yet his eyes did not rest. He knew gossip was not harmless. It drew men like flies to honey, men who believed themselves owed. Near midnight, the sound came again. A knock, firmer this time, carrying the weight of certainty. He rose, boots pressing heavy against the floorboards, and stood before the door. The knock came again, steady, waiting. He glanced back at the children curled beneath their blanket, their faces soft in sleep, their breaths unguarded. Then he turned, hand resting on the latch, knowing with bone-deep certainty that whatever stood outside was not gossip whispered in daylight, but the first shadow come to claim its shape. The knock did not fade this time. It pressed against the cabin door with a rhythm that demanded answer, a rhythm that seemed to echo through the wood and into his bones. The rancher set his jaw, opened the latch, and stepped back as the door swung wide. A man stood there, lean and sharp, his face carved from bitterness and whiskey. His clothes were worn but not from work, his boots scuffed from wandering. Behind his eyes flickered a hunger that was not for food but for control. He tipped his hat only halfway, his gaze sliding past the rancher to the small shapes bundled on the bedroll. "They're mine," he said, his voice flat as a rusted blade. "Blood calls for blood. Hand 'em over." The twins had woken with the first knock. They clung to each other now, their small bodies trembling, their eyes wide with the dread of recognition. One let out a faint whimper, and the other pressed a hand over her mouth, as though silence might make them invisible. The rancher stepped into the doorway, filling it with his bulk. He said nothing at first, letting the silence weigh heavier than words. The man shifted, uneasy, but pressed on. "You ain't their kin. ain't their father. You think the laws stand for this? Folks already talkin'. Best you don't give them more to say." The rancher's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained steady. "They're safe here." The words fell simple, but they carried the force of stone. Still, the man sneered. "Safe? Safe with a stranger? Don't fool yourself. The sheriff will hear of this. And when he does, you'll have no choice." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though the venom in it carried. "Blood's mine. Don't matter if I spill it or spare it. They'll come back with me." The rancher did not move, his body a wall between the intruder and the children. Behind him, the girls clung tighter, their small voices whispering his name as though invoking it for protection. The man stepped closer, the smell of liquor heavy on his breath. His hand twitched toward his belt, not for a weapon but for the weight of habit, a gesture meant to remind, to threaten. The rancher's hand hovered near his own, but he did not draw. He would not let the moment become blood and smoke, not with the children watching. Instead, he planted his words with the same steadiness he used to drive fence posts. "They're not going anywhere with you." The silence that followed was thick as storm clouds. The man's eyes burned, his mouth twisted. He spat into the dirt, rage brimming where persuasion had failed. "This ain't done. Sheriff'll be here by sundown tomorrow. And when he comes, he'll bring the law with him." He turned sharply, boots striking hard against the porch, and swung into the saddle of a waiting horse. Dust rose in his wake as he rode off, his threat hanging heavier than smoke in the cabin's air. The rancher closed the door, the wood shaking faintly as the latch fell back into place. He leaned against it for a moment, feeling the weight of the choice pressed upon him. He could carry the girls into town, hand them over before trouble deepened. It would end the whispers, ease the judgment, and leave him to his quiet solitude once more. The town might even thank him for keeping order. But when he turned, his eyes met the small faces peering out from beneath the blanket. Their cheeks were pale, their lips trembling, but their gaze, fragile as it was, held a flicker of faith. One child whispered, voice thin as smoke, "Don't let him take us." The rancher felt the words cut deep, sharper than any blade. He had lived long in silence, long in solitude, believing it safer to keep his heart bound. Yet here, in their plea, he felt the truth. His choice was no longer only his. It was written in the trust that had begun to grow, in the laughter by the corral, in the way their tiny hands clutched his coat as if anchoring themselves to the earth. He moved to the hearth, crouched low, and stirred the embers. The fire flared, throwing shadows across the room. He looked at the girls and spoke with quiet resolve. "Whatever comes, you're staying." The words were plain, but to the children they were a vow. They pressed closer together, their bodies softening as the blanket slipped from their shoulders. Their eyes glistened, not free of fear, but holding the fragile light of belief. Outside, the night stretched long, every sound on the wind a reminder of what was promised to arrive. The rancher sat by the fire, his frame bent but unbroken, his mind steadying itself against what morning would bring. He did not know what the law would decide, nor how heavy the town's judgment might grow. But when dawn came, soft and gray, he rose and set about his chores as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. For in the stillness between strikes of the axe and the hush of the girls' breaths, he carried the weight of his choice, silent, resolute, and unshaken. By mid-morning, the road bore the sound of hooves again, steady and certain, carrying with them the promise of reckoning. The sound of hooves grew louder, filling the road with a weight that pressed against the cabin walls. The rancher stood at the window, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set hard as stone. Behind him, the twins huddled together on the bedroll, their breaths quick, eyes wide, their small fingers gripping the stitched doll between them as though it might keep them safe. Dust curled above the horizon, and soon the sheriff rode into view, his coat heavy with authority, his face weathered by years of judgment. At his side, the lean man from the night before smirked with the confidence of one certain the law would back him. The sheriff dismounted slow, his boots sinking into the dirt with the gravity of what was to come. The knock on the door this time was not frantic but deliberate, 3 strikes that carried the weight of order. The rancher opened it without hesitation. The sheriff's eyes searched his, steady but not unkind. "I hear you've got children in there," he said, his voice low, measured. "And I hear claims been made they belong elsewhere." "They belong safe," the rancher answered, his tone quiet yet firm, each word carried with a weight of conviction. The lean man pushed forward, his words sharp. "Safe? With him? He's no blood, no kin. They're mine by right, and you'll see it done proper. The town's already talkin'. You want to stand against them too." The sheriff raised a hand, silencing the man, then looked past the rancher into the dim cabin. His eyes softened at the sight of the girls. They shrank back, clutching the doll tighter, their lips trembling. One whispered, barely audible, "Don't make us go." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He stepped inside, the room thick with the weight of his presence. He crouched near the children, his weathered face softened by the fire's glow. "Girls," he said gently, "you got something to tell me?" For a moment, silence held. Then, trembling, one spoke. Her words spilled like stones breaking loose from a dam. "He hurt us. Before. We hid. He found us." Her voice cracked. The other clung to her, nodding, eyes brimming with tears. "We don't want him. Please." The sheriff let the silence linger, the truth hanging heavy in the air. The lean man's face twisted, rage flaring, but the sheriff rose before he could speak. His gaze, cold and sharp now, cut into the man. "Blood ain't claim enough to chain a child," he said. "The law won't carry them back into harm." The man spat into the dirt, fury rising. "You'll regret this. All of you." He turned, mounting his horse with jerking motions, and rode off in a cloud of dust, his curses lost to the wind. The sheriff watched until he disappeared, then turned back to the rancher. "You've taken on a heavy load," he said, voice low, almost tired. "But it's yours now, if you mean to keep it. Folk'll talk. They always do. But I'll stand by what I saw here." The rancher gave a single nod, nothing more, yet his silence carried the weight of a vow. The sheriff tipped his hat and left, his horse's hooves fading into distance, leaving the cabin in quiet once more. Inside, the girls had not moved, their small bodies still pressed tight together. Slowly, the rancher crossed the room. He crouched low, his giant frame folding into their world, and extended his hand. Not to command, not to claim, but to steady. They looked at it, then at him. Hesitant at first, they reached out, their small fingers curling around his. The fire snapped softly, the only witness to the moment. He gathered them close, one under each arm, holding them as he had the morning he found them, but now with something deeper than rescue. This was belonging, fragile yet real. That night, the cabin glowed warm. On the table, he placed bowls of spaghetti, simple, strange to the frontier, yet made with care. The girls ate with small smiles breaking through their fear, their eyes lifting more often to watch him, no longer flinching at each sound. When one yawned, heavy with sleep, her cheek fell against his arm, and he did not move, letting her rest there as if his body were made for nothing more than their safety. Outside, wind stirred the new chime he had hung from the porch, its soft ringing carrying into the night. It was not wealth, nor marriage, nor the kind of life the town measured in acres and gold. It was smaller, humbler, yet fuller. The girls whispered to each other as sleep pulled them down, their voices soft but certain, "We're good now." The rancher sat in the hush, the weight of gossip gone from his shoulders, replaced by the steady burden of love freely chosen. His eyes lingered on the fire, on the small figures curled beneath the blanket, and something inside him eased, something long locked away. It was not a mansion, nor a promise shouted loud. It was spaghetti on a wooden table, the soft laughter of children finding home, and the way trust grows not with speed but with sincerity. The cabin, patched and weathered, breathed with new life, and in that quiet, he understood, this was the kind of strength the world could not take away. And as the wind chimes sang low on the porch, the hollow log in his memory emptied of fear, filled instead with the sound of hope being born. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.